I'll get around to commenting on Dan's promise versus peril, but do you want me to answer that now? Or?
No. Interested in Dan's. You probably disagree with me as well.
Ray calls something, he has what he calls the law of what is accelerating returns, and he says he's interested in exponential growth technologies. But of course, as he knows as well as anybody, if you look at nature, you see none of those exponential curves go on for very long. Mrs. Housefly says to her husband, you know, we flies have done pretty well, but it's really taking off now. You know, I just laid 1 million eggs, and if each one of those lays 1 million eggs, pretty soon we're going to cover the planet 3 feet deep in flies. It doesn't happen, does it? In fact, to a first approximation, every species on the planet, the parents replace themselves with exactly 2, and that's the average. And there are no known exceptions to this. There are periods when you get exponential growth, and then it levels off, and the curve levels off. You get diminishing returns, not accelerating returns.
That deserves a reply because, I mean, that's at the core of this thesis, which I've written extensively about. And it's true, every paradigm runs out of steam because it meets some natural limit. But what happens in the history of information technology, and I've shown there's been 5 major paradigms already in the field of computation and go back to the 1890 census. It leads to research pressure for the next paradigm. They were shrinking vacuum tubes in the 1950s. They ran out of steam. They couldn't shrink the vacuum tubes anymore and keep the vacuum. That was the end of exponential growth of vacuum tubes. But it was not the end of the exponential growth of the price performance of computing. We went on to the 4th paradigm, transistors, and then chips. Gordon Moore predicted Moore's law would come to an end in 2002. Intel now says 2022. But they also say that they have the 6th paradigm working in their labs, and the crossover will be in the teen years, which is computing in 3 dimensions, and there's already some 3-dimensional chips out there. And yes, then you might say, well, okay, so you can go from one paradigm to another, but that can't go on forever. That may be true, but this 6th paradigm will take us to a point where even using the most conservative estimates of the amount of computation required to emulate the human brain, we can create very inexpensive, very small computers that will be millions of times more powerful than the human brain using the 6th paradigm of 3-dimensional molecular computing based on the kinds of circuits that have already been developed. So the law of accelerating returns jumps from paradigm to paradigm. There probably are ultimate limits. I talk about, in fact, what they are based on what we know about the physics of computation in the singularities near. The 6th paradigm will take us through the 21st century to a point where these computers will be vastly more powerful than human intelligence. So you don't need a 7th paradigm. The 6th paradigm is going to be quite profound.
I don't believe a word of that. You're talking about hardware, and think about what's happened with software and what's always going to happen with software. Software is very unlike hardware. 25 years ago, David Parnas wrote very eloquently and deeply about this. Hardware, you can make basically a bigger, faster, more wonderful device, or smaller, faster, more wonderful device. It's got 1 million parts, it's got 1 billion parts, it's got 1 trillion parts, but the parts are all the same. Software isn't like that. And software development is much more art than just technology, than science. And if you look at the development of software over the same period, you see some striking things. Word for 2010 is, I made the calculation a couple days ago, the Word that I have on my laptop is 4,000 times bigger than the WordStar I used 20 years ago, and slower. And there are many things that it does better, but there's some things it does worse. And software has gobbled up the Moore's law, benefits and will continue to do that as far as anybody can see. What are we going to use all this extra bandwidth, all this extra speed and power for? If history is any judge, and I'm going to, this is like one of Ray's curves, probably what we can expect in the next 20 years is that a lot of this computing power and communication power will go into the development of ultra-high definition, three-dimensional, multisensorial pornography, interactively. Now, maybe that'll be the wonderful, wonderful thing. But it's going to soak up terabytes of communication if that's simply extrapolating from the past.
Yes.
Well, something that we're seeing, though, is that while software may have limits if it's centralized in its nature, what we've seen with iTunes and the App Store is that by mobilizing the community to participate in the innovation, in the development, in the sense that you're not actually centralizing intelligence, but you're actually getting intelligence to happen on the periphery. So you're allowing the technology as a platform, and then you're asking your community to participate and to actually start to take and expand the technology further. We're actually seeing an incredible array of applications, software, innovations that have really transformed the landscape for mobile devices. And this has really not been brought about by the companies themselves necessarily, but it's been brought about by third-party application developers. I mean, the kinds of applications we're seeing, whether it be in health and wellness, it's just scanning a simple device on your mobile phone, or to doing e-commerce transactions through an attachment to the phone. I mean, these are the kinds of things that the companies themselves probably didn't anticipate, but because they embraced the power of the community, they applied a paradigm that's similar to that used in the internet and the web, and really crowdsourced and used the power of many. It's really led to an incredible amount of innovation. And I think this is what we've seen also in my own field of brain research. And when we first started working in this space, the whole idea was to create a device that will allow people to move things simply with their minds. Now, this may sound like a completely crazy science fiction idea, and a lot of experts I spoke to at the time said that it simply wasn't possible. But we were able to create something that is completely non-invasive, and I'll show it on Friday so that you can get to see it yourselves. And it really does allow you to move something just by thinking about it. And we had a brief conversation before this session with Dan where this was contemplated in terms of an implant in your brain, but now it's done non-invasively. And what we found is, whilst we may have had the idea as the innovator, the pioneers in this space, by opening up the platform to a bevy of developers worldwide. We've got a footprint now in more than 90 countries worldwide. The amount of innovation we're seeing in this space around brain research is phenomenal. It's really going to accelerate at a pace and a scale that was previously unimaginable, because in the past we didn't have the mechanisms for a connected database where we could share information, where we could actually exchange ideas. And so I think that these are the kind of new paradigms that will shift the opportunities and the kinds of applications that we will see in the next 20, 30 years. And, by definition, we are very innovative people. And
so it's moving much more to an open source, peer-to-peer kind of...
That really is the model that's most powerful. This idea of open source, of open collaboration, is really far more powerful than proprietary systems. And I think that many more companies are trying to find a nice balance between the two.
Let me respond to what Dan said, because that's...
And then we'll move on.
Go ahead.
Because it's a very common criticism. Hardware is progressing exponentially, but software is stuck in the mud. It's not true. First of all, citing what is a mature technology that really doesn't need to improve, which is word processing, is not a good example. There's many different ways to measure software in terms of complexity, the ability to solve basic problems in engineering and science. There was a major study done recently by the scientific advisory board to President Obama, which looked at this question exactly, hardware versus software in terms of improvement, and looked at a wide range of engineering and scientific problems, and concluded that software had made more progress than hardware. Typically, there was an improvement over the last 15 years of 32 million to 1 on a whole broad set of engineering problems, 32,000 to 1 from software and 1,000 to 1 from hardware. And since they're multiplicative, it was a total of 32 million to 1. The software has gotten enormously more sophisticated and more complex. And you can just look at the actual cutting edge of what software can do. Take Watson, for example. How many people have heard of the IBM Watson computer that played Jeopardy and won the Jeopardy game? I had predicted in the early 80s that a computer would take the World Chess Championship by 98, and I also predicted that when we did that, we would dismiss chess as being of any importance. And that happened in 97. People said, oh, well, it's to be expected a computer would play chess. It's a logic game. But computers will never match human ability to deal with natural language. So Jeopardy is exactly that. It's dealing with the most subtle kinds of language, puns and metaphors and similes and jokes and very convoluted natural language. Not only was it able to command those Jeopardy queries, but the knowledge to know, for example, who that 16th century queen with blonde hair in Holland was not spoon-fed to Watson. Watson actually went out and read on its own Wikipedia and other encyclopedias and understood this natural language, hundreds of thousands of pages of it, and was able to take command of all that. A really very dramatic display of an ability to do a quintessentially human task. It got a higher score than the best 2 human players put together. People are now talking to their iPhones with Siri. It's not perfect, but people aren't perfect either. We know it's going to improve, and it's already quite impressive. Google cars, driverless cars, have driven 200,000 miles without human drivers through busy cities and towns of California. There's a human in there to take over, but they don't take over. The cars drive by themselves. There are many other impressive examples of computers doing what humans used to do, and these are very recent examples. And so to say that software is stuck in the mud, and to use an example of word processing, is really not to look at the full range of what software is capable of. And the human brain also uses repetitive elements. We understand there's one mechanism in the cerebral cortex that does pattern recognition. It's a complex little system, but it's repeated 1 billion times. So repetition is not just exclusively in computers. That is how an intelligent process works. But we are making insights that are really exponential in nature in terms of understanding the human brain and in getting this increasingly complex hardware to do more and more sophisticated tasks.